Timur the Lame, also known as Tamerlane, was one of the greatest and most brutal conquerors in all of history. Over the course of his storied 44-year military career, he never lost a major battle and left 17 million dead in his wake, a grand total of 5.4% of the entire living population on Earth at that time. From his base in Central Asia, his endless wars brought him as far as modern-day Ukraine, India, and finally Anatolia, where he would see his greatest triumph. This is the story of history's last great nomadic conqueror, a man who many would come to call the Prince of Destruction. Timur was born in 1336, a member of a Turco-Mongolic steppe tribe named the Barlas, their pastures being located about 50 miles south of the city of Samarkand. In the grand scheme of things, Timur was a nobody, or at least he should have been. His name, however, connected him to none other than Genghis Khan. Timur means iron. Genghis Khan's original name, Temujin, means exactly the same in Mongolian. Not much is recorded of Timur's early life, but we can presume that he grew up in the harshness that is the Eurasian steppe, a life of constant movement, grazing hordes of horses, and becoming an expert hunter. Timur was just another nomadic face in an ocean of grass and yurts. He didn't come onto the political scene until the age of 24. The Chagatai Khaganate, who the Barlas were subservient to, had been plunged into civil war. The Chagatai were one of the successor states left behind by the Mongolian Empire after their disintegration. Internal conflict as of late had plagued the descendants of the Great Khan, and in 1347 the eastern portion of the Chagatai Khaganate seceded and started governing themselves as Mogulistan, under their new Khan, Tughluq. In 1360, Tughluq would invade the Chagatai with hopes of reunifying the Khaganate under himself. When news reached the Barlas chief that Tughluq was approaching, he simply packed his bags and ran in the opposite direction. A few members of the Barlas stayed behind, chief among them being Timur. Tughluq succeeded in conquering the remnants of the Chagatai. Timur used this opportunity to grasp at power for himself. He met with Tughluq, pledging his allegiance to him, and in turn, he named Timur as the new chief of the Barlas tribe, giving him an advisory role to his son, Ilyas, who would be the new governor of the conquered Chagatai Khaganate. Conflict quickly arose between Ilyas and Timur over what we don't exactly know. In response, Timur decided to rebel against Mogulistan in 1361, joining the side of a not yet subdued Chagatai nobleman named Hussein. To cement their alliance, Timur married Hussein's sister, as the pair began to fight tooth and nail against Ilyas and his eastern horde. The going was rough for the two rebels. They barely had any manpower to recruit from, and resorted to stealing livestock from the common folk just to get by. The pair did find small-scale success conducting guerrilla warfare on Ilyas's army, but in many ways, Timur and Hussein were just bandits. But the ends were supposed to justify their means. By 1363, their situation had become dire, as they failed to defeat any of the Mogulistan armies in an open battle. On a raid set to capture much-needed food from a local tribe, Timur would come face to face with death. Before Timur's party could escape with their looted animals, a few horsemen appeared to deter these bandits. Timur began to run, but took an arrow to the knee, as well as in the hand. He was then left for dead by his men. Miraculously, Timur dragged his bloodied body to safety and rejoined his small band of marauders. The consequences were extreme, and he lost 2 fingers on his right hand. Not only this, but Timur's leg never recovered, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, thus trademarking his title of Timur the Lame. One may think that this would make Timur appear more weak, and that he might take a break from adventuring. However, this only served to strengthen Timur's name on the steppe, making the man all the more terrifying to his enemies. After recovering from his wounds, Timur decided to put his new reputation to the use. Tamerlane and a small band decide to finally confront Ilyas in a traditional battle, or what Ilyas thought would be a traditional battle. The night before the confrontation, Timur ordered the burning of hundreds of campfires, suggesting that his force was much larger than it actually was. In the morning, he chose his battlefield expertly, picking flat ground with arid, almost sandy land. With this force outnumbered multiple times over, Timur decided to keep using psychological warfare to boost his number. He tied leafy branches to the legs of all of his horses, kicking up sand and dust as they thundered towards their foe. This served to scare Ilyas's army as they soon lost hope and began to retreat. Timur chased this fleeing army and slaughtered many of them before the day was over. With Hussein and Timur's first large-scale victory won, the two leaders consolidated their control over the rest of the Chagatai Khaganate, as Ilyas retreated to Mogulistan. With this, Hussein named himself as the Emir of Chagatai, while Timur served as the lead general and governor of Samarkand. Hussein, being a descendant of the Great Khan, was the head of this dual rebellion, as his reign was looked on as much more legitimate than an upstart Barlash chief. While their rebellion had ousted Ilyas from Chagatai, he still lived and started to rebuild his army in hopes of reclamation. In 1363, Ilyas succeeded his father as Khan of Mogulistan, and he would return to Chagatai in 1365, again with a massive army that outnumbered Timur's multiple times over. Despite this, Timur would meet Ilyas on the battlefield, and this time, the Barlash chief would be defeated for the final time in his military career. With the path to Samarkand open, Ilyas besieged the city as Timur sent word to Hussein for reinforcement. What Hussein sent to his best general was nothing more than a small raiding party, and he never left the walls of his capital to defend his second largest city. Despite having no support from Hussein, Samarkand held out, as the siege faltered in a few months and Ilyas returned to Mogulistan. Chagatai's position had been secured, of course with absolutely no help from Emir Hussein. Timur's beloved city had almost been taken. He would surely not forget this inaction. Hussein was not only absent in protecting his realm, but he also laid heavy taxes on his people, who soon began to despise him. In turn, especially in the north of Chagatai, people started to favor Timur more than the emir himself. In 1366, Hussein's sister, and Timur's wife, died. While taking her body to be buried in Balkh, Timur entered the city and was met by many applauses, thus signifying a start to a rivalry between the two longtime brother-in-laws. Timur returned to Samarkand and Hussein returned to exploiting his own people. Eventually, by 1370, Timur had enough of his subservience and entered into an open rebellion. Hussein, as he had shown previously, was eager to hide behind his walls while Timur did all the fighting. Eventually, Timur took the city of Balkh and deposed Hussein, executing him shortly after. In his place, Timur named himself as the Emir of Chagatai, but not before marrying the wife of the headless Hussein, Sarai Khanum, a direct descendant of Chinggis Khan himself. She would remain a steadfast advisor for the remainder of Timur's life. After rising from bandit to emir, Timur returned to Samarkand, naming the city that could be described as the next closest thing to his hometown as his capital. While Timur is now a self-proclaimed emir, he was still the son of a nobody in a small and forgotten tribe. To solidify a sense of legitimacy in the lands that he claimed as his own, he appointed a descendant of the great Chinggis Khan himself as the new Khan of Chagatai. This shrewd political move would guarantee the legitimacy of Timur's reign in the eyes of his Turco-Mongolic subjects. But make no mistake, this new Khan was simply a puppet, completely under the control of Emir Timur. Timur consolidated his newly won realm over the next 2 years, before he began the military campaigns that he would one day become so notorious for. Just as the old Mongolian Empire had started their conquest of Iran and Khwarezm, so too would Timur the Lame. In 1372, Timur invaded Khwarezm, going to the first city in his path. He sacked and looted it, killing all men and taking the women and children as hostages. This was a precursor to the dark cloud that was about to shadow all the Middle East. Having shown that the sword was being brought down onto him, The leader of Khwarezm came to a deal with Emir Timur. He would keep the western half of his lands along the Caspian Sea and rule as a vassal subject, all while Timur subjugated the eastern half of Khwarezm and added it to his own growing empire. And just as Timur appeared to burst onto the scene, he halted his conquests for nearly a decade. Perhaps he felt some level of guilt putting an entire city to the sword, or maybe Timur simply wanted peace after leading a life consumed by warfare. Another explanation for this pause in Timur's otherwise endless campaigns is the death of his son, Jahangir Mirza, who passed away in 1376. It is reported that Timur was grief-stricken and entered into a period of long mourning. But just as one son died, another appeared before him. While it was not his true son, Timur would consider this man, named Tokhtamesh, as his understudy. Tokhtamesh was a descendant of the Great Khan and a contested ruler of the White Horde that controlled the land just north of Timur. Tokhtamesh's father was killed by the Khan of the newly created Golden Horde that had unified both the White Horde and the Blue Horde. Tokhtamesh never forgave him, starting multiple campaigns to avenge his father, all proving to be failures. In 1376, just as Jahangir died, Tokhtamesh arrived, one missing a father, the other a son. Perhaps this is why Timur brought him into his court and agreed to support his ticket as Khan of the White Horde. Timur gave him soldiers and money to begin his reconquest of the White Horde. Tokhtamesh established himself at a few key strongholds between the Caspian and Aral seas. The Khan of the Golden Horde, Urus, immediately sent out one of his sons to deal with the troublesome Tokhtamesh. The prince managed to defeat the pretender, but at the cost of his own life. Tokhtamesh returned to Timur once more, and in turn, he granted him more men and resources. Tokhtamesh re-established himself between the two seas and started conducting raids deep into the Golden Horde. Khan Urus sent another son south, this one managing to defeat Tokhtamesh without dying. Instead, it was Tokhtamesh who nearly died, only escaping by fleeing across the Sri Darya River. The defeated Tokhtamesh returned to Timur, this time with the more pressing issue. A Golden Horde army was in hot pursuit, and if he didn't act soon, they could conquer Timur's small Khanate. In short time, the diplomats arrived in Samarkand, demanding Tokhtamesh be handed over to them. Timur refused to do so, hereafter gathering a sizable army for the first time in 4 years. In the winter of 1376 and 1377, Timur led his own army to consolidate Tokhtamesh's rule over the southern Golden Horde. Here, the Prince of the Golden Horde and Tamerlane maneuvered their armies around each other for 3 months, each attempting to gain a strategically favorable position on the other. With Timur proving to be a much harder man to catch than Tokhtamesh, the Golden Horde army retreated. Soon after this, Khan Oros died, and with this, Timur officially declared Tokhtamesh as the new Khan of the White Horde. It would take this young Khan 3 years to defeat the other sons of Oros and establish his authority over the entirety of the Golden Horde. While Timur was on his brief campaign, his vassal subject in Khwarezm took the opportunity to revolt. Timur veered his undamaged army south and arrived before the walls of the rebel stronghold city of Originz in 1377. Once arriving, the leader of the revolt challenged Timur to single combat. Timur, who, might I remind you, holds the nickname of the Lame, accepted. When he approached the walls, only accompanied by his sword, the rebel leader quickly changed his mind and chose not to face the battle-hardened Emir. Soon after, this rebel grew ill and died, leaving his city to face the wrath of Tamerlane. Originz was sacked and left in ruin, with women and children being taken as slaves. For the next 4 years, Timur continued supporting Tokhtamesh and returned to his irregular peace. Soon enough, he grew tired of this and turned to the many sultans, shahs, and emirs of Iran to expand his realm. In the wake of the Mongolian invasions of Iran, the conquerors created their own state in the region called the Ilkhanate. This didn't even last for a century until the nomadic conquerors converted to Islam and settled down, leading to a weakening of the realm and its eventual disintegration. Succeeding the Ilkhanate was a host of many quarreling nations, all trying to gain supremacy over Iran. In 1380, Timur demanded that his neighbors, the Kartid dynasty, surrender to him. When they rejected, the Timurid army marched on the Kartid capital of Herat. Here, Timur took the city and gave it the usual punishment of complete destruction. Herat wouldn't be rebuilt for some 30 years. After showing what befalls those who do not surrender, the rest of the Kartid realm fell to Timur without so much as a fight. Following this, Timur turned west to the realm of the Sarbadars. Infighting had already consumed them for some time, leaving them weak and in no position to oppose Emir Timur. Hearing of the reputation that preceded Tamerlane, they surrendered without a fight in 1382, and were treated respectfully in turn. With his initial push into Persia proving a massive success, Timur returned to Samarkand, enriching his capital with the wealth earned on his campaign. Here he remained for a little over a year before gathering a new army and marching into Iran once again. Timur turned his attention west to the prosperous land of the southern Caspian Sea coast known as Mazandaran. Here he captured the key city of Touraine with no fight, subduing the region. Going west still, Timur entered the lands of the Jalurid dynasty, the most powerful of the Ilkhanate successor states and home to one of Timur's most irritating rivals, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir. Unlike the other minor Iranian players, Ahmad Jalayir refused to surrender to Timur, dooming himself and his country to complete destruction. The Timurid army captured the Jalurid capital of Tabriz, its population being put to the sword. Timur probably would have continued conquering the rest of the Jalurid realm, but he was forced to return to his core territories. Another revolt had broken out in Khwarezm that threatened Samarkand itself. By 1385, Timur had made the long journey back to Khwarezm, defeating the rebels and plundering the city of Urgench for the second time. Timur destroyed the walls of the city, and for the defenders who had once manned those walls, he allowed them to continue their defense forever. Timur had a new wall erected and cemented the rebels into the foundation. While Timur was absent from Iran, Ahmad Jalayir attempted to retake Tabriz, to no avail. In that same year of 1385, another army arrived before the walls of Tabriz, not one of the many Iranian states. Instead, it was the Khan of the Great Golden Horde, Tokhtamesh. The man who Timur had helped so much was now showing signs of his true ambitions. Tokhtamesh sacked Tabriz just as his mentor had. Timur responded by sending an army to recapture Tabriz, but by the time they arrived in 1386, Tokhtamesh was long gone. Instead of ignoring this insult to his authority, Timur decided to take action, marching north and in the direction of the Golden Horde. Timur conquered much of modern-day Azerbaijan, setting up a second front with the Golden Horde. Going west along the Caucasus mountain range, Timur soon arrived on the doorstep of the Kingdom of Georgia. In the times before the Great Mongolic Horde, Georgia had created a vast empire in the Caucasus and beyond. But after the Mongolians conquered Georgia, it was left to only its core territories, leaving it as a small Christian state in a sea of Islamic nations. Seeking to rile his people up against these heathens, Timur declared himself the defender of Islam, and directed his wrath onto the Georgians. At this time, Georgia was under the rule of King Bagrat V, a man described not only as a generous ruler, but also an excellent general. No matter how good of a commander that Bagrat may have been, he was forced to deal with insurmountable odds. Timur's massive horde could not be stopped in open battle, so Bagrat fell behind the walls of his capital, Tbilisi. The walls of the old city held out for a few months before they finally fell on November 22nd of 1386. What followed was a massacre of the Christian and Muslim population alike, showing that the defender of Islam may not be what he seemed. King Bagrat V and most of his family were captured and brought back to Samarkand, where they were forced to convert to Islam. During this time, Bagrat's son, George, retook Georgia and styled himself as King George VII. Timur sent the converted Bagrat back to Georgia with a host of 12,000 to reclaim his throne as a vassal of the Timurid Empire. As the army approached Tbilisi, they were ambushed by Bagrat's son, who annihilated his father's 12,000-man escort. Bagrat had, without the knowledge of his captors, wrote to his son and helped orchestrate this ambush. With the independence of Georgia reclaimed, Bagrat V renounced Islam and secured an alliance with Tokhtamesh, thus concluding the first of Timur's 8 separate invasions of Georgia. With 2 subjects now betraying and aligning themselves against him, Timur marched west. Going along the same route through Mazandaran, he arrived in modern-day Azerbaijan by 1387. With his alliance to Georgia, Tokhtamesh had already started making moves into the eastern Caucasus. Despite this, Timur continued his march on Tbilisi. With help from their new ally, the Georgians managed to hold off Timur's army for some time before he was forced to withdraw. He probably could have reconquered Georgia if not for Tokhtamesh making serious headway in Azerbaijan. Timur turned his army to defeat his old ally, which he did with ease. With the Georgian campaign stalled, Timur moved south, not to conquer, but to simply claim his inheritance. The ruler of the Muzaffarid dynasty, who controlled lands along the coast of the Persian Gulf, had left his nation to Tamerlane in his will. This was a wise choice to submit to the great conqueror in order to preserve the life of his family. However, not all of his sons agreed with this choice. The eldest of these boys refused his father's will and took control of the capital at Esfahan. When Timur arrived there in 1387, his grand host of horsemen convinced the son to surrender without a fight, leaving what would have been his kingdom to Tamerlane. With the Muzaffarid dynasty subdued, Timur continued in his real goal for this campaign, the reconquest of Georgia. But before he could make serious gains, he would again be forced to withdraw. The Muzaffarid that had submitted to him started to rebel. To secure this new gain, Timur marched south and did what he should have done in the first place. A ruler who reigns through fear alone needs to show his dominance. Thus, he sacked the cities of the Muzaffarids, massacring their populations. The city of Esfahan would suffer the most, with 70,000 lying dead in their treachery. With the Muzaffarid realm being reduced to ash, Timur probably restarted his march on Tbilisi, and just like before, he would never get there. In the east, an old friend threatened the heart of the Timurid realm. This was, of course, Tokhtamesh. Tokhtamesh was proving to be a nuisance in the sight of Timur, but in 1387 he took this conflict to a place where relations could never recover. Tokhtamesh invaded the Timurid Empire, not in the western theater this time, but in the east. He took the city of human walls in Urgench and marched on Samarkand itself. He even went as far as besieging Samarkand, although the walls of this steppe city held firm and persuaded Tokhtamesh to continue raiding more lightly defended settlements. This left the center of the Timurid realm in disarray, as many of the cities not conquered by Tokhtamesh began to rebel. Timur returned to Samarkand, and after fully grasping this situation, he moved to reconquer his lands. Starting with Urgench, the city of human walls was besieged, and for the third time, its civilian population was massacred. Maybe this time they would learn. Over the course of 2 more years, Timur and his army undid what Tokhtamesh had caused, reunifying the Timurid Empire as it had been by 1391. After reconsolidating his empire, Timur gathered an army and marched north to confront a man whom he had once mentored. Diplomats from the Golden Horde sought peace with Timur, but an attack on Samarkand was a bridge too far. The long road ahead of the army would be filled with rivers and plains, prime steppe for his horde of horses to graze. Going north from Samarkand, Timur went around the Aral Sea and turned west until reaching the next widest body of water, the Kundurcha River. Here, Tokhtamesh waited with his own army to defeat his erstwhile ally. The Battle of the Kundurcha River started with Toktamish attempting to flank the Timurid force with his cavalry. He was successful in this, but it also just walked into Timur's trap. While the Timurid flanks held their ground, the center of the army made for a huge push against Toktamish himself. With both of their generals behind them, the center of the battlefield turned into a bloodbath. Eventually, Timur's middle broke Toktamish's center, and the Khan of the Golden Horde began to flee, along with his entire army. Before Timur could get to Toktamish, he had already escaped to the other side of the Kundurcha River, along with much of his army. Timur had won the battle, but as long as Toktamish was still alive, he would do anything to defeat his foes, no matter how many times he was defeated himself. Satisfied with this victory, Timur returned to Samarkand and arrived there in 1392. While he was gone, the pesky lands of the Muzaffarids revolted once more. Timur made his way there and dealt with the rebellion in quite possibly the cruelest display of power. He killed all civilians inside, and outside Esfahan, he left an unimaginable warning. Multiple teetering towers of skulls were left outside to bleach in the Persian sun. This convinced the rest of the rebellion to disperse in good time. After this dramatic display, Timur moved north to deal with his Iranian rival, Ahmad Jaliyir. From Esfahan, Timur moved towards Baghdad. The city unsurprisingly submitted to him without a fight. With the Jalirid premier city in his grasp, Timur continued taking the rest of the Sultanate with little resistance. The conquest would have been complete here if it was not for Sultan Ahmad Jaliyir, who retook Baghdad and the south of his realm in the absence of Emir Timur. Normally, Timur would have marched to Baghdad and massacred its population, but this was not the Prince of Destruction's major goal in this campaign. Timur was here to open up the other front with Toktamish in the Caucasus and defeat him here like he had in the east. First on Timur's hit list was Toktamish's ally in Georgia, the newly crowned King George VII. In 1394, Timur sent 4 generals to bring southern Georgia to the sword. After massacring the Kartvelians, Timur sent his son, Mirhan Shah, with an army to retake Tbilisi and capture its king. All while Timur continued north with the main army to confront Toktamish and his allies in Chechnya. Mirhan Shah probably expected an easy victory, but was shown firsthand the stubbornness of the Georgians. After marching through the mountains, Mirhan besieged the city of Alinjak. King George VII marched there with an army and caught Mirhan Shah off guard. Here, the son of Timur was defeated and forced to rejoin with his father in Azerbaijan, marking the second of 2 Timurid armies that were defeated by King George VII. Of all Timur's rivals, none found more success than the King of Georgia. Timur subdued Toktamish's Chechen ally by 1395, plundering the city of Derbent and everything north of that until reaching the Terek River. Here, at the banks of another river, Toktamish prepared to meet Tamerlane. If to be believed, the armies were of near equal strength and numbered about 100,000 men each. Toktamish opened the engagement by sending a vanguard of a few thousand to disrupt and distract the Timurid army away from the main advance. This was in turn met by Timur surrounding and killing most of them. The true battle on the Terek River started with Toktamish ordering an advance on Timur's right flank and middle, hoping to turn the Timurid army and leave it exposed. The fight was grueling, and Timur even participated alongside his soldiers in the melee, almost meeting his end on multiple occasions. All the while, Toktamish sat back and watched, waiting for his moment to retreat, as he always had. The battle raged on as a stalemate, and Toktamish looked in hope for his army to come out on the other side. But Timur had sufficiently dug into the landscape, making his camp and fortifying it to suppress any advances from Toktamish at night. The next morning, the 2 armies arrayed themselves for battle once more. Toktamish opened the battle by sending his right flank to Timur's left. However, this was only a gambit, as Timur's left pursued their attackers and were led into a feigned retreat, whereafter they were surrounded and forced to flee the battle. With Toktamish taking the first phase of the battle, he advanced on his foe's weakened army. Seeing this made Timur retreat back to the safety of his fortified camp, all while Toktamish took to besieging the Timurid army for the better part of a day, before he was forced back by the approaching nightfall. The next day, the two armies went back to formations and stared at each other across the plain. This time, Toktamish sent his left flank to subdue Timur's right. Once sufficiently baited, the Timurid flank fell back and dismounted their horses, standing behind them after placing stakes in the ground to prevent the Golden Horde cavalry to wreak havoc on the horseless archers. Behind their mounts, the archers let loose devastating volleys, while part of Timur's personal bodyguard charged and forced the Golden Horde left flank back. The two armies were matching each other in every way. The advantage would not be earned on the battlefield, but in treachery. After the day's engagement was over, Timur wrote to the leader of a tribe on Toktamesh's left flank, and when Toktamish awoke the next morning, he found half of his left flank deserted from the field. This did not halt Toktamish, but did serve to anger him. The next morning, he ordered an all-out charge on the Timurid army. However, with the weakened left flank, he was pushed back and nearly surrounded. Himself and the remnants of his army fled the field and escaped. Timur had defeated Toktamish for the second time, but as always, he had escaped to fight another day. The Prince of Destruction did not turn back to Samarkand, but decided to make sure that Toktamish and the Golden Horde as a whole would never be a threat to his empire ever again. What followed was a spree of massacres across the Golden Horde's most prosperous cities. From Astrakhan to Yelets, Timur's armies plundered their way across the heartland of the Golden Horde, leaving tens of thousands dead in their wake. Toktamish and the Golden Horde would never recover from this complete sacking, and both would never pose a serious issue to Timur after this, especially after he installed a much more loyal puppet as the Khan of the Golden Horde. Toktamish was likely Timur's greatest rival, not because he was the most powerful, but simply because he was partly trained by Timur himself, and knew the Emir well. While their alliance disintegrated into quarreling, I have taken the time to think about a world where Timur and Toktamish were steadfast allies and what that might look like. And that world was terrifying. If these two nomadic conquerors had each other's total cooperation, then there's no telling what their destructive sum could have been. By 1396, Tamerlane started the long journey back to Samarkand, going through the South Caucasus and, for once in his life, deciding not to pillage and rape Georgia as he passed by it. Instead, Timur headed straight for the Jalurid Sultanate, retaking Baghdad and the south of Ahmad Jalir's land. From here, Sultan Ahmad retreated into the Ottoman Empire, seeking their aid against the nomadic conqueror. Timur went back to Samarkand, concluding 6 years of campaigning. He remained in his capital for about a year before returning to his life on the road. This time, his goal was not to campaign in the north or in the west, but in the southeast and into the Indian subcontinent. At this time, northern India was under the domain of the Delhi Sultanate, who had reigned supreme here for over 100 years. As of recently, however, the Sultanate had fell into internal conflict and a shrinking of its borders from outside powers grasping to take its place. India was ripe for conquest, and the intelligent conqueror could plainly see that. But first, Timur needed a reason to fight the Delhi Sultanate. In 1397, Timur's least favorite grandson, Pir Muhammad, was given land directly bordering the Delhi Sultanate. It's unknown what Pir Muhammad did to anger his grandfather, but Timur is known to have scolded him harshly on 2 separate occasions, if not more. This was a redemption campaign for Pir Muhammad, who followed Timur's orders and began raiding into India. The Delhi Sultanate, in turn, began raiding Timurid lands, giving Tamerlane all the reason he needed to invade. As 1397 turned into 1398, Pir Muhammad's raids escalated into full-scale invasion, sacking the border cities on the Indus River. All while Timur was making his way down to India with a massive army of some 80,000 Eurasian nomads. He arrived by the latter half of 1398, where he crossed the Indus River, and joined his grandson in pillaging the Delhi Sultanate. Timur met no opposition as he continued east toward the crown lands of Delhi itself. In his way, there was only one thing that could stop him: Batnar Fort, a structure thought to be impregnable. However, the fort was lightly defended, and Timur arrived there, seeking their submission. The fort's commander, trying to save his garrison, surrendered and left the safety of Batnar to confront the warlord. He gave up the fort to Timur, but soon after, found himself stranded in the middle of an enemy army. The defenders inside the fort refused to acknowledge their commander's surrender and closed the gates behind them. Hereafter, the garrison's leader was killed by Timur's men whilst his army descended on Batnar Fortress. What followed was a bloodbath. Inside the fort, the men killed all the women and children, saving them from the wrath of Tamerlane. The fort didn't hold out for long before the Timurid army stood tall on the walls of an impregnable fortress. With his only obstacle erased, Timur continued marching on the city of Delhi, and just outside the city he was confronted by the young Sultan and an army that numbered just as much as his. This Indian army was made complete by a grand host of elephants that sported chainmail armor and poison-tipped tusks. The battle outside the walls of Delhi would be one of Timur's greatest strategic feats over his career. He started the battle not by attacking his foe directly, but psychologically. He orchestrated his prisoners, numbering some tens of thousands, to be lined up in front of their sultan, and executed with no remorse. After this, Timur distracted the flanks of his enemy by sending his cavalry wings to harass the Indians with many feigned retreats. Once they were sufficiently engaged with Timur's wings, another portion of the Timurid cavalry swept into the forward cavalry of Delhi and crushed them. After this, Timur withdrew his army to realign, as they were at the start of the battle. Deposing of Delhi's forward cavalry left their most dangerous weapon, the elephants, completely exposed. After realigning his men, Timur ordered for a full-scale charge of his entire army. The flanks of Delhi fell first and were forced away from the battlefield, leaving the Sultan only with his infantry and elephants in the center. For the elephants, Timur had assembled huge caltrops that he placed all around them, and after setting the trap, Tamerlane sprung it by sending camels to panic the elephants. This proved utterly successful, as the Sultan's ace was torn from his deck. With his army in shambles, the young Sultan retreated behind the walls of Delhi. Timur did not give chase. Making camp just outside the walls, Timur decided to wait until the next day to take the city. During that long night, the Sultan snuck away successfully, leaving Delhi to face the Prince of Destruction alone. Timur, if it can be believed, had no intentions of plundering the city, but I really don't think he came all this way for nothing, and soon enough his army began looting Delhi. Not just for 1 or 2 days, but for 15 whole days, the Timurid army plundered every last bit of gold, taking many prisoners, and after the 2 weeks of hell were finished, Delhi wouldn't be considered a city for another 15 years. After raising one of the wealthiest cities in the world, Timur began the journey back to Samarkand, his multiple-mile-long caravan of valuables jingling just behind him. While the Indian campaign was nothing short of a success, Timur chose not to conquer any part of the Delhi Sultanate. It's unknown why, but perhaps Timur did not want the trouble of defeating Hindu rebellions in his empire. Or maybe he just wanted to loot Delhi. Ironically, Timur's descendants would one day rule from the city of Delhi that he had just reduced to rubble. Tamerlane didn't stay in Samarkand for long before going out on the campaign that would forever cement his bloody legacy. When it was all said and done, this 7-year campaign would take Timur to the edges of Asia, where he would kill thousands and imprison one of the most important men in the world. Unsurprisingly, this campaign would start in Georgia. For the past whole decade, the fortress of Alinja withstood a Timurid siege led by Tamerlane's son, Mirhan Shah. Alinja Fort was on top of a mountain and could only be attacked on one side, leaving it nearly impregnable. However, after a decade of grogging siege warfare, it looked as if the Georgians inside might just give up their fight. and that's when King George showed up. In 1398, George VII led an army to lift the siege of Alinja Tower, and just as he had previously defeated the son of Timur, so too would he in 1398. The liberated Alinja could now restore its provisions and prepare to hold off an entire army, hopefully for another decade. Mirhan Shah returned to his father, defeated once again by the King of Georgia. This caused a reaction from Timur, who had only just arrived in Samarkand from his sack of Delhi. Tired of this constant Georgian thorn in his side, Tamerlane assembled a massive army numbering some 140,000 men from across the empire. Surely this could bring King George to his knees. By late 1399, Timur had arrived on the borders of southern Georgia. Showing what happens to those who resist, he once again raided deep into the country, burning village after village. This continued until the early spring of 1400, when Timur decided to finish Georgia once and for all. Tamerlane, while he was seething mad, was still smart enough to avoid a conflict with George VII if he could. So, he wrote to the king and gave him one last chance. The King of Georgia responded by marching his army to a defensive position on the Sagrim River. The Georgian numbers for this battle are unknown, but it surely couldn't have been more than 15,000 men, while Timur's army nearly outnumbered him 10-1. This did not faze these mountain warriors, who held steadfast in their defense as a swarm of cavalry shook the earth and clouds of arrows rained down onto them. Seeing his defeat was imminent, King George eventually withdrew his army and retreated from the field. George could not beat Timur in an open battle, without a miracle, but one thing that could best the predominantly cavalry-based army of Timur was the vast forest and steep mountains of Georgia. With this knowledge, King George evacuated his largest cities and took to the woods with his army, where they would conduct unrelenting guerrilla warfare. Timur did not even give chase to the heavily entrenched Georgians in their forest fortress. Instead, he turned his frustration onto all those who King George could not evacuate with him. Timur sacked Tbilisi again, but had a Napoleon in Moscow moment, as the jewel of Georgia was all but abandoned by its inhabitants. With the forest cut off, Timur moved from city to city, province to province, raising hell wherever he went, destroying churches and livelihoods and leaving starvation behind wherever his army struck. By the end of Timur's Georgian campaign, he had gathered more than 60,000 slaves, depopulating an already small country. When Timur left, King George emerged from his forest, only to see that his country had been utterly ravaged. This is when George VII realized that resistance was simply futile. While Timur probably would have loved to plunder Georgia for the rest of his days, an old rival showed up to cause more trouble: Ahmad Jalayir. For the past few years, the deposed Jalayir had made residence in the Ottoman court of Sultan Bayezid, better known by his incredible nickname of the Thunderbolt. While the Ottomans wished to avoid a battle with Timur, they did want to slow his continued conquest by supporting his rivals on each of their borders. When Ahmad Jalayir arrived in his former lands with a fresh army, Timur knew exactly who to punish. Ahmad Jalayir was easily defeated by the Timurid horde, as before, he retreated into the protection of the Ottoman Empire. If this upstart Anatolian Beylik was going to house his rivals, then Timur was going to make sure that they paid for it. Tamerlane invaded and took the city of Sivas, completely looted it, and buried the garrison alive. The Ottomans only responded by retaking the town once the Prince of Destruction had already left. This was only a warning, a calm before the true storm. After showing Bayezid the destructive capability of the Timurid host, Tamerlane moved south and into the Mamluk-controlled Levant. Just like the Delhi Sultanate, the Mamluks of Egypt were enduring a period of decline. Young and ineffective rulers combined with a weak and unmodernized army to create a failed state. Not only this, but the Mamluks had already angered Timur the Lame. More than a decade ago, Timur had sent ambassadors to the city of Aleppo. Upon arriving, these diplomats were killed. A declaration of war just waiting for Timur to activate. In 1400, Timur started his invasion from the north, taking the city of Antioch without a fight before moving towards Aleppo. The governor of the city decided to confront Timur outside his walls, where he managed to hold him off for 2 days before retreating into Aleppo. Then, Tamerlane destroyed and looted Aleppo, avenging his diplomats by piling the skulls of his victims outside the city in multiple towers of heads. Leaving these foreboding structures behind, Timur pushed down the Levantine coast before reaching the city of Beirut. They refused to surrender, and were therefore met by utter destruction. Continuing south, Timur pushed on to the city of Damascus, where he was once again met by a Mamluk army. This was swiftly dealt with, and they fled the field, leaving Damascus to the mercy of Tamerlane. With one of his largest cities about to be annihilated, the Mamluk Sultan sent an entourage to negotiate for Timur's withdrawal. Notable among them was Ibn Khaldun, a renowned philosopher and historian. The diplomats did manage to bribe Timur for peace with a large sum of gold. But this was only a farce, as Timur continued the siege of Damascus in earnest. And after taking the city, he killed everyone inside. In a disturbing display, Tamerlane told the various religious leaders to house their women and children in their mosques. Once these innocents were inside the safety of the mosques, Timur burned them down. So much for being the defender of Islam. After plundering the rich cities of the Levant, Timur started returning to Samarkand. He would be forced back by none other than Ahmad Jaliyir, who had just retaken Baghdad. Timur quickly reared his army around and retook Baghdad again. Here, his most brutal massacre would occur. He killed everybody inside and naturally made 15 separate towers of skulls outside the city, numbering some 90,000 people. That's about 6,000 human heads per tower. Hereafter, Ahmad Jaliyir never made another serious attempt to undermine Timur the Lame. With his journey home stopped cold, Timur decided to continue his campaign. Going north, he turned to the fields of ashes he had left in Georgia only 2 years ago. In late 1401, Tamerlane arrived on the Georgian doorstep, and soon after, the tower fortress of Alinja fell to him, after holding out for 13 years. King George VII could have retreated into his forest and could have withstood Timur in a guerrilla defense, but at the cost of the innocent, undefended people of his country being murdered and enslaved. King George finally surrendered to Timur and agreed to become his vassal. With all his rivals subdued, Timur had but one man who could prove a challenge. That, of course, being the Thunderbolt, Ottoman Sultan Bayezid. While Timur was bringing Georgia under his heel, Bayezid had attacked and taken Timurid lands in the far east of Anatolia. This caused a flurry of letters between the emir and the sultan. These guys literally did the medieval equivalent of roasting each other, taking turns jabbing at each other's character. But words are only that. Timur, who could neither read nor write, took up the sword to see if Bayezid would stick to his pen. In 1402, Tamerlane invaded the Ottoman Empire for the second time, retaking the land that Bayezid had stolen in the previous year. This left the Ottoman Sultan in quite a bind. While Timur was plundering his eastern holdings, Bayezid was conducting a siege of Constantinople. The Ottomans probably could have taken the last Roman holdout here if it was not for Timur the Lame. Bayezid reluctantly lifted the siege and marched east in the direction of the Timurids. Bayezid tracked down the Timurid army who had remained in eastern Anatolia, and after a short confrontation he managed to rout his enemy's army and defeat the great nomadic conqueror. The army that Bayezid had just defeated was only a ruse to distract the Sultan from Timur and his main army, which had circled behind Bayezid and began sieging the city of Ankara. Upon learning that he had been outmaneuvered, Bayezid, who got his nickname of The Thunderbolt, by the speed at which he conducted campaigns, began a full-scale run back to Ankara. The land here was dry and the sun hot. The arid Anatolian steppe gave no water, and only exhausted the Ottoman army. With canteens running low, Sultan Bayezid promised all the water in the world once they reached Ankara and the river that accompanied it. These promises fell through, however, as the Timurid army had diverted a whole river so that the Ottomans could not refill their canteens unless they wished to fall victim to Timurid arrows. This left Bayezid with one option: defeat Timur and get a glass of water, or succumb to dehydration and be defeated anyways. What culminated would be one of the greatest battles in all of history. The two armies lined up, Timur outnumbering his foe by nearly 30,000. The battle began on the Ottoman left, led by Prince Suleiman. To defend the Timurid right was Mirhan Shah and a large contingent of cavalry behind a few dozen elephants. When the two flanks clashed, they matched one another in a brutal melee. After this, Timur ordered a full-scale charge of his army, and as the two armies collided, they were again matched. On the Ottoman right, the Timurid horse and elephant charged the lines of Bayezid's most powerful vassal, Stefan Lazarevich, and his heavily armored Serbian knights. The Serbians managed to push the lightly armored Timurid cavalry back to the point where they looked as if they might break. However, with the rest of Bayezid's army not finding success, the Sultan ordered Lazarevich to return to the lines where the main battle still urged on. At this point, Sultan Bayezid had the upper hand, but what he could not anticipate was his own mercenaries' betrayal. So far, they had remained unengaged on the left flank, but once Timur gave a signal, they crashed into Prince Suleiman's contingent and surrounded it, causing the Ottoman prince to retreat, leaving his father to face Tamerlane. With this, the numbers were firmly in the hands of Timur, who advanced his entire army, only holding his bodyguard back in reserve. In response, the Serbian knights withdrew from the right flank and helped the struggling Ottoman center. After crushing one-third of the Timurid middle in a devastating charge, Stefan Lazarevich made his way to Bayezid, urging him to retreat while the loyal Prince of Serbia held off the Timurid host. Bayezid refused, choosing to defeat Tamerlane or die trying. The Sultan withdrew his entire army, including Prince Lazarevich, allowing them to make a run for it, while Bayezid and his bodyguard lined up on a nearby hill to make their last stand. The Timurids completely surrounded the Sultan and, on Timur's orders, charged their soon-to-be defeated foe. Bayezid now fought side by side with his men for the rest of the day, turning back the Timurid charges in one final heroic display. By nightfall, Bayezid was ready to make his escape. With 300 of his household guards and 2 of his sons, Sultan Bayezid broke the Timurid lines and made a run for it. Escaping the battlefield that should have costed him his life, he urged and pressed his horse forward. The Thunderbolt was proving true to his moniker as he outran the Timurid army. His hopes were, however, dashed when his horse lost its footing and threw Bayezid to the ground. The Sultan was taken prisoner along with his 2 sons, and Bayezid would spend the rest of his life in jail, where by all accounts he was treated well along with his sons. Bayezid would die only a year later at the age of 42, perhaps poisoning himself to deprive Timur of his greatest trophy. After Bayezid's death, Timur released his 2 sons, returning them to an Ottoman Empire that was eating itself alive. With their father gone, the Sultan's sons began fighting over who should be his next successor. This event, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, nearly destroyed the House of Osman and their empire. This devastation lasted for over a decade and was all caused by Timur the Lame. With the Ottoman Empire's central authority shattered, Timur concluded his siege of Ankara before turning his gaze on the whole of the Anatolian peninsula. Going from town to city, he looted and pillaged each and every province, even managing to take the Ottoman capital of Bursa and burning it to the ground. Upon conquering Anatolia, Timur gave all the beyliks who had just fallen to the Ottomans during the reign of Bayezid their independence. This should have ensured that the Ottomans would never pose a threat again. In Timur's lifetime, this was true, but the Ottomans would one day rise far past Anatolia and become the hegemon of the Middle East for centuries. With their biggest threat subdued, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II sent many gifts to his liberator, seeking an alliance with the powerful Tamerlane. Timur declined the offer, knowing a weak ally when he saw it. On top of the Byzantines, the rest of Europe suddenly became very aware of the man who had just crushed the boogeyman of the Balkans. After the Battle of Ankara, Timur held frequent correspondence with the monarchs of Europe, especially Charles VI of France. And by the end of Timur's life, the two would come to ally one another as both defensive and offensive allies. In Timurid lands, Genoan and Venetian traders were also allowed to continue their lucrative businesses, which served to enrich the empire as a whole. For Europeans, Tamerlane, the Prince of Destruction who made towers of skulls out of innocent people's heads, was viewed as a crusading liberator. While we're on the topic of crusaders, the Knights of Rhodes, the final crusader state, was put to siege by Timur. Not on the island of Rhodes, Timur would have been a fool to try to take that stronghold, but on the Knights' mainland holding of Smyrna. The Knights of Rhodes had been preparing to meet the Eurasian warlords since his initial invasion of Anatolia. The defenses were fortified, a massive trench was dug, and ammunition was at an all-time high when Timur arrived on December 2nd of 1402. Timur offered the Crusaders one last chance to surrender on the condition that they convert to Islam. This was, of course, rejected, and the 200 defenders inside were confident that Smyrna could halt any invader. The Rhodian Knights held off multiple attempts to take the fort by employing Greek fire to burn those who attempted to scale the walls. After 2 weeks of a stout defense, Timur's army managed to mine under the walls and place explosives, thus resulting in a huge portion of the wall collapsing, allowing the Timurids to infiltrate Smyrna. While some of the knights held back the eastern horde, most of them got on their boats and sailed back to their headquarters in Rhodes, leaving the civilian population of Smyrna in the hands of Timur, who promptly killed them all. Hereafter, Timur ordered that Smyrna be completely destroyed. On top of conquering vast swathes of the Middle East and Central Asia, Timur had also just defeated the last mainland crusader stronghold. After taking Smyrna and reinforcing his Turkish puppets in Anatolia, Timur wasted no time in going back to what he loved doing the most: plundering and steamrolling Georgia flat into oblivion. King George VII, after his surrender, remained loyal to his Timurid overlord, but he made one crucial mistake. Although this wasn't part of his vassal clause, he had failed to congratulate Timur on his great victory at Ankara. Upon receiving word that Timur had returned to punish Georgia, George VII sent many luxurious gifts to the victor of Ankara. This was only met by Timur besieging the fortress of Byrtvisi. This small fort sat on the top of a mountain with steep and unwalkable cliffs on nearly every side. Just looking at Byrtvisi, it is clear that this tower would be impossible to take. Wishing to avoid another long, drawn-out siege in Georgia, Timur ordered his best climbers to scale the walls and open the gates. The 150 Georgians inside managed to repel 8 separate attacks before they were overwhelmed and the gates were opened, thereby opening the route for Timur to raid the lands of central Georgia once again. Learning that the Hellgates had just opened, King George VII retreated all the way to his most northern province of Abkhazia. This left the rest of Georgia undefended, and in all, 700 towns, villages, and cities were massacred by Timur the Lame. He only relented when his own men began to feel sorry for the Christians. By 1404, Timur stopped his raids and allowed George VII to continue ruling as one of his many vassal kings. Finally, after more than 20 years and 8 separate invasions, the Georgians would endure their final pillaging from the Prince of Destruction. With Bayezid defeated and dead, the Ottomans in shambles, and Georgia on fire, Timur finally decided to bring an end to his grand 7-year campaign, beginning the journey back to Samarkand in 1404. Tamerlane laid eyes on his flourishing capital on the steppe by 1405. At this point, he was nearing his 68th birthday, but he was still a domineering figure and just as strong mentally as he ever was. While Timur was gone, trouble had been brewing in the north. Edigu, the new leader of the Golden Horde, stripped off his Timurid vassalage and started ruling on his own accord. Although there were no direct conflicts between the Golden Horde and the Timurids at this time, Tamerlane decided to support his old ally and more recent nemesis, the notorious Tokhtamesh. After his defeat on the Tarik River, Tokhtamesh had continued in his ceaseless wars to reclaim his seat as Khan. By 1400, his resistance had been pushed all the way to the bleakness that is Siberia. In a desperate last attempt, he called for his old mentor to aid him. Surprisingly, Timur responded by sending him money that allowed Tokhtamesh to hire a group of mercenaries. Tokhtamesh would continue losing and retreating from his failed battles until he was finally killed by a hail of arrows in 1406. While Tokhtamesh and Timur would be fierce rivals for most of their lives, it's good to see that in the end, Timur came to the aid of his younger understudy. In 1405, a short time after arriving in Samarkand, a letter from the Spanish crown arrived in the court of Tamerlane. As it was read out to him, a few words caught his attention, namely, China, and revolt. With turmoil consuming the Ming dynasty, this is all the aged Timur needed to know before assembling his army to start his most ambitious campaign yet. Tamerlane planned to raid China and possibly conquer it just as the Mongols had some centuries ago. With his largest army to date, Timur left Samarkand in the middle of winter. An inopportune time for such a faraway campaign, but Timur was in the midst of fighting off the Grim Reaper. Tamerlane took one last look at Samarkand, a city which had not only grown under him, but had prospered into the greatest city in Central Asia. Before he could even leave Timurid lands, he died on February 18th of 1405, at the age of 68. There's no telling what would have happened on this campaign if Timur had lived long enough to lead it. The Ming dynasty was more stable than Timur had been told, but knowing Tamerlane, he probably would have sacked the Chinese countryside until arriving at the walls of Beijing and beheading the emperor. But we can never know. Timur's body was prepared by wrapping it in rose-scented linens, and his body was sent to Samarkand in a shiny black coffin. Here he was buried and left undisturbed for over 500 years, no one daring to release the devil that lay inside. His epitaph reads, "If I come back to life, the world will tremble. Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." On June 19th of 1941, his final resting place was disturbed by Soviet archaeologists. Perhaps it was the curse of Timur, or just mere coincidence, but 2 days later, the Nazis started Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. What followed was utter destruction on both sides, with over 5 million casualties all combined. The victor of this offensive would be a man born in the hunting grounds of Timur, Georgia. And like Timur, he was crippled in both arm and leg. And like Timur, he was a Eurasian emperor, who killed even more people than the Prince of Destruction himself. Tamerlane was, without a doubt in my mind, an evil man. No one ruled through fear better than him, perhaps until Joseph Stalin. When it was all said and done, Timur had sacked thousands of towns, exterminating 5.4% of the entire population on Earth, numbering some 17 million people in all. These genocidal actions were mostly conducted on a majority Muslim population, all while Timur himself claimed to be the defender of Islam. If we put all of the bloodshed, which is most of his story, to the side, we do see another side to the Prince of Destruction. The only people who Timur spared over his many campaigns was the learned scholars. Every time he came across one, he sent them straight to Samarkand, which quickly led the steppe city to undergo a renaissance. On top of sparing the scholars, Timur also enjoyed talking with them and learning from them. The great conqueror could typically be seen arguing philosophy with some of the brightest minds of his day, showing that Timur was much more than a bloodthirsty tyrant. Although he couldn't read or write, Timur was a highly intelligent, bloodthirsty tyrant who held education to the highest degree. Timur was the last of the great nomadic conquerors, and perhaps the greatest among them. In a dying age where guns were starting to make the horse archers of the steppe obsolete, Timur rose from a simple bandit to become the most powerful man of his day. Truly a story of bloody rags to even bloodier riches. The conqueror of Iran, the warden of Bayezid, the bane of Georgia, and the destroyer of Delhi truly earns his nickname of the Prince of Destruction. Might I remind you that Timur did all of these things while missing 2 fingers and having a crippled leg. So what's your excuse to get off your couch and stop watching YouTube and go conquer the world and I spent too much time on this script. I just need to go. Timur the Lame, one of history's most brutal and unforgiving conquerors, is devising his next grand strategy. The checkered table in front of him offers no answer to the nomadic warlord. A few moments pass before he finally remembers the lateral strategy he had learned from his campaigns in Persia. But just as his hand touches the 2 pieces lined in front of him, a servant rushes into the room and hurriedly informs Timur that one of his wives had just given birth to a son. Without hesitation, Timur declared that the child be named after the next chess move he was about to make, Shah Rukh, or King Rook. Better known as castling, this unique chess move features the king and rook swapping places. How coincidentally true this spur-of-the-moment name would prove to be for Timur and his 4th-born son. It was almost as if it was prophecy that Shah Rukh, against all odds and even himself at times, became the inheritor of the Timurid Empire. Shah Rukh was born on August 20th of 1377 in the Timurid capital city of Samarkand. His mother's origins are up for debate, but many historians point to one of Timur's Tajik concubines. Regardless of his maternal origins, he would be raised by Timur's chief queen, Sarai Khanum. Shah Rukh would spend the next 20 years either in Samarkand or joining his father and brothers on campaign. These 3 brothers from oldest to youngest were Umar Shaikh Mirza, Jahangir Mirza, who died a year before Shah Rukh was born, and finally, Mirhan Shah. All 4 brothers had different mothers, none of which included Queen Sarai Khanum, muddling any plans for a future succession. When Shah Rukh was only 11, he was married off to the daughter of one of Timur's most steadfast nobles. Her name was Gawar Shadnand. Their marriage, although arranged, would be filled with nothing but love. Shah Rukh found one of his greatest advisors in his wife, and she would prove to be indispensable for the empire. In 1394, Shah Rukh would move one step closer to the Timurid throne, when his older brother, Umar Mirza, died on his way to Samarkand. Prince Umar had been the governor of the recently conquered and still rowdy Fars province. While passing a rebel-controlled fort, a single arrow fell from the sky. It landed directly in the neck of Umar, who fell from his horse and bled out within moments. When Shah Rukh turned 20, he was finally granted his long-overdue post as governor. He would overwatch Khorasan, one of the most vital junctions in the empire, for it connected the steppe capital of Samarkand to the salty waves of the Caspian Sea. Although this seat of power was a prestigious one, it was also one that his brother Mirhan Shah held when he was only 13 years old. The relationship between father and son was never a bad one, but it was never recorded as a particularly fond one. Perhaps after the death of Jahangir and the birth of Shah Rukh in such a short time made the fearless Timur scared to get attached. He was an emotional man despite massacring millions. This strange relationship could also be explained by Shah Rukh's own fondness for Islam. While Timur was the self-proclaimed protector of the faith, he did not take the religious as seriously as Shah Rukh did, for the traditions of the steppe were still firmly embedded in him. One area where Timur enjoyed seeing Shah Rukh the most was the battlefield. The Timurid prince frequently joined Timur on campaign and, more often than not, held command on one of either flank. In 1402, Shah Rukh's mettle would be tested on the biggest stage, the fields of Ankara. During this pivotal battle, Shah Rukh held his flank despite a corps of Serbian knights led by their prince, Stefan Lazarevic. Together, the Timurids defeated the Ottomans and captured their ruler, Sultan Bayezid. With his greatest conquest behind him, Timur attempted to top it. In 1405, he left Samarkand for the Far East. His destination was China, and all the wealth that came along with it. Shortly after leaving, the 68-year-old conqueror grew gravely ill. The always moving Timurid army came to an abrupt standstill. It soon became clear that Timur the Lame was dying. As he laid in agony, he had repeatedly but one wish. I have no other desire than to see Shah Rukh once more. This last wish would never come true. Timur died on February 18th of 1405. This wish to see his fourth-born and chronically overlooked son is a thing of mystery. Maybe it was a later invention by Shah Rukh, or maybe Timur could see the future that laid ahead of him. What followed Tamerlane's death would be a succession dispute unlike any other. He failed to provide his empire with any designated heir, meaning it would be a contest of arms to see which son or grandson came out on top. Shah Rukh, stationed as the governor of Herat, was far from the Timurid crown lands around Samarkand. Regardless, he made his bid for the throne and declared himself both Sultan and Shah. Where Timur was only an emir, Shah Rukh styled himself as a true ruler. His domain during these early days comprised of western Afghanistan and most of the north and central parts of Iran. The most legitimate of Timur's heirs by blood was his eldest grandson to his eldest son, Pir Muhammad. Pir Muhammad had previously been disgraced on 2 separate occasions by Timur himself. Although he made up for it in India, displeasing the emir would have long-lasting impacts on his legitimacy. He rose claiming the throne just as Shah Rukh had, but no one, not even his own brothers, supported him. To make matters worse, he was even farther from Samarkand than Shah Rukh and completely cut off from him. To preserve his own life, he pledged himself to his uncle, Shah Rukh. This in turn lended Shah Rukh the legitimacy that he lacked. The most obvious claimant for the Timurid throne was nervously in his corner of the board. While Shah Rukh may have had the most land during the opening phases of the Civil War, he did not own the city that tied it all together. In Samarkand, the once small steppe outpost had become the centerpiece of a massive and now splintering empire. It fell to an unexpected descendant of the emir, another of his grandsons, this one being the son of Timur's only other living son, Mirhan Shah. Khalil was the second favorite of Timur's many grandchildren, most notably overshining Pir Muhammad in India. Timur even granted him the governorship of the fertile Fergana Valley, only a stone's throw away from Samarkand. Upon learning of his grandfather's death, Khalil won the race to Samarkand and took the city without opposition. He declared himself Sultan Khalil. Hot on his heels was another experienced grandson of Timur, While all previously discussed grandchildren have been sons of Timur's sons, Hussein was a son of one of Timur's many daughters. He took 1,000 loyal followers and marched on Samarkand to press his unlikely claim on the throne. The now Sultan Khalil had barely won the race. Seeing that he had firm control over the city, Hussein pledged himself to his cousin's throne. While Khalil claimed the throne, his father was busy in his own corner of the Timurid Empire. In the east, he governed a realm centered around modern-day Azerbaijan. Mirhan Shah, although positioned with a sizable army, had a long road ahead of him if he was going to reach Samarkand. Not only did the descendants of Timur carve up his once mighty empire, but so too did his enemies. The most persistent of Timur's rivals was a man named Ahmad Jaliyir. Timur had conquered and reconquered his lands 4 times over before he finally gave up. But when Timur died, he decided to fair his chances with his descendants. When the Mamluk Sultan learned of Timur's demise, he sent Ahmad Jaliyir along with another old Timurid rival, Kara Yusuf of the Black Sheep Turkoman, also known as the Kara Kanulu. During Timur's initial invasion of Iran, Ahmad Jaliyir and Kara Yusuf had allied against Tamerlane, to no avail. Although their countries no longer existed, their alliance remained active as they marched to reclaim. With the board set, it was time to play a game of thrones. Shah Rukh, as his namesake might suggest, waited, patient and still to make his move. He didn't have Samarkand, but neither was Samarkand positioned to challenge him, especially since Mirhan Shah had failed to return from the east. Ahmad Jaliyir and Kara Yusuf pushed deep into Mesopotamia and started taking Mirhan Shah's own lands in Azerbaijan. Now, in a 2-front war, he was forced to stay back and hold off the once conquered. While Ahmad Jaliyir was no more than a pushover, Kara Yusuf this time around would prove to be all they both needed. In 1406, the Black Sheep Turkomans defeated a Timurid army led by another of Mirhan Shah's sons. This guaranteed the existence of a revived Jalirid and Kara Kanulu state. It also prevented any chance for Mirhan Shah to help his son in Samarkand. Negotiations between Shah Rukh and his nephew had been ongoing since Timur's death. So far, there had been no progress. Soon enough, Sultan Khalil invaded Shah Rukh's lands. Neither proved as competent on the battlefield as the man they were attempting to replace. No matter how long they campaigned against each other, there was never a conclusive engagement, and neither came close to besieging their opponent's stronghold. They would continue having on and off battles throughout their dual reign. In 1405, likely while Khalil was absent from Samarkand, another claimant to the Timurid throne attempted to seize the crown. Hussein, who had pledged his loyalty to Sultan Khalil in that same pivotal year. This would be stomped out in no time. Hussein would be executed, ending his own dynasty that had originated on the Mongolian steppe nearly 250 years ago. But his journey did not end there. His decapitated head would be stuffed with straw and sent to the doorstep of Pir Muhammad. A warning and something of an invitation. This would be his fate if he continued siding with Shah Rukh. The year after the death of Timur, more failures would follow his offspring. Sultan Khalil lost control over a large portion of land between the Aral and Caspian seas. Not to Shah Rukh, but to a tribal coalition of all things. If someone didn't unify the rest of the Timurid realm soon, then the many enemies of Timur would continue picking apart what remained of his empire. In 1407, Shah Rukh would have to deal with a similar problem. A rebellion had broken out in the city of Asterbad. This, unlike Sultan Khalil, was contained and put down. The leader of this rebellion fled to Pir Muhammad for shelter, likely persuading him to join his revolt. As a sign of loyalty, Pyre sent the rebel to Shah Rukh. In the following year, Khalil's power would be further and drastically weakened. In the west, Kara Yusuf was continuously defeating Timurid garrisons with ease. To stem the Black Sheep wave, Mirhan Shah was still in the west. The decisive confrontation for control of western Persia would occur in 1408. At the Battle of Sardar, Kara Yusuf sent the son of Timur running in defeat. While Mirhan Shah did escape, he would soon be caught and executed by a subordinate of Kara Yusuf. His head would be placed on a spike and presented to the city of Tabriz. This induced the Timurid garrison to surrender, and after this his head would be sent to his brother, Shah Rukh. With western Persia gone, a large portion of suitable farmland had went with it, leaving Samarkand particularly vulnerable. Soon after, a famine broke out in the city. Many died, and the ones unlucky enough to survive blamed Sultan Khalil for their suffering. Khalil's popularity started to tank in the capital and in the rest of his lands. While he had angered the common folk through their stomach, the nobility was furious with his wife. She had much influence over Khalil and began appointing members of the non-noble class to high points in the court. With everyone at his throat, Sultan Khalil was left with little option other than to leave Samarkand and surrender to Shah Rukh. Shah Rukh marched unopposed to Samarkand and was welcomed into the city. He had won a civil war without fighting a decisive battle. As his name suggested, he waited patiently for his time to swap spots with the kingpiece in a masterful move. Instead of executing his nephew and rival, Shah Rukh spared Khalil. He even named him as the governor of Rey, bordering Kara Yusuf, in a similar position his father was in just before his death. Shah Rukh then named his scholarly and multilingual eldest son as the governor of Samarkand and the Crown Lands, the infamous Ulugh Beg. While his story is a notable one, we will get to it after Shah Rukh's. As Khalil adopted the titles of Timur, Shah Rukh took the Islamic titles of Sultan and the Persian Padshah, even though the first part of his name means king in Persian. In this, Shah Rukh continued the long-standing tradition where the people who conquer Iran suddenly become as Persianized as their subjects. It happened to practically all the steppe empires of Persia, the Parthians, Mongols, and now the Timurids. After 4 years of war, Shah Rukh was finally at the head of a smaller, but much sturdier Timurid empire. But just as Shah Rukh had nursed the ailing empire back to health, one of his most important relatives and governors died, Pir Muhammad. He would be assassinated in a plot orchestrated by his own military. Seeing this, his brother, Iskander, fled to the safety of Shiraz. Enduring a long journey while wearing only a shirt, a hat, and a single boot. After streaking his way across eastern Persia, Iskander gained the favor of Shiraz and struck back at his brother's assassins, killing them and reclaiming Pir Muhammad's portion of the empire. While Pir Muhammad was largely an independent ruler, Iskander would take this onto another level, proclaiming himself as a sultan. The calm Shah Rukh did not react much at this, however. Unlike Sultan Khalil, Iskander had the popularity needed to live true to his moniker. He, like Ulugh Beg, was a true scholar. He appointed many learned men to his court. On top of this, he also garnered support from the religious leaders he also invited. Even still, he issued many buildings and ordered historical and scientific works be written. With stability restored, Shah Rukh sat back comfortably on his throne, but there was still a storm brewing in the west, under the will of Kara Yusuf. In 1410, he took another powerful step by betraying his closest ally, the somehow still alive Ahmad Jaliyir. Although he was defeated plenty by Timur, the great nomad could never capture him, and he remained a thorn in his side. Kara Yusuf did what he could not, finally capturing Ahmad Jaliyir and executing him. His land now fell under the domain of the growing Kara Kanulu. Where Shah Rukh's rival fell, only a year later a previous enemy would meet an unfortunate end. Sultan Khalil committed suicide alongside his wife, likely shameful that he could not hold on to the most powerful empire in the Middle East. In that same year, the Eastern Chagatai Khanate finally made a move against the Timurids, who were originally carved out of the Western Chagatai Khanate. The Chagatai army began a march on Samarkand. They were, however, not strong enough to face their Western counterpart and were eventually submitted to a peace treaty. Now, at peace for some time, Shah Rukh intended to finally face Kara Yusuf. He invited his vassal lords to campaign. All but one answered his summons. Iskander, the self-styled Sultan of Timurid Fars, declined Shah Rukh's invitation. To make matters worse, he also began minting his own coin, something only an independent ruler had the right to do. Shah Rukh, the ever-patient man, could not let this go unchallenged, and turned his army meant for Kara Yusuf onto Sultan Iskander. By the next year, 1414, Shah Rukh captured his opponent's capital of Esfahan, which just so happened to be the site of one of Timur's most brutal massacres. Unlike him, Shah Rukh spared the city, only after capturing another upstart nephew. Iskander's lands were therefore split between his two remaining brothers, Rustam and Baikara. Shah Rukh gave the elder brother, Rustam, his rebellious sibling, to do with what he wished. So he blinded him before handing him over to Baikara. To cement his rightful claim, Shah Rukh used to play Iskander most assuredly would have used on him if he had won the civil war. He ordered a detailed history be written about Iskander's rebellion, written by the victor. The drama with his nephews was not yet over, however. Iskander the Blind convinced his caretaker brother, Baikara, to start his own rebellion. Shah Rukh ordered Rustam to march with him against another brother. He accepted, and by December of 1415, Baikara surrendered. He was spared and exiled, but Iskander was nowhere to be seen. The blinded rebel had escaped, and somehow managed to go some ways north before being discovered by a group of Turkish nomads. After being handed to Shah Rukh, he gave him straight back to Rustam, who, this time, executed him. Having proven his loyalty yet again, Rustam was promoted to the role of Supreme Army Commander. In this position, he would remain until his own death 10 years later. Following this, Shah Rukh decided to suspend his campaign against Kara Yusuf for the foreseeable future. He was a patient man, and it was clear that his empire needed more time to recover from its many civil wars. But this peace could not last forever, with the warlike descendants of Timur surrounding him. In 1418, the Gawar Shad Mosque was completed, built by and named after Shah Rukh's beloved wife. It's safe to say that it is a masterpiece, the inside being a kaleidoscope of geometric patterns and the outside sharing a Turkic-Persian influence. A true representation of the Timurid dynasty. During these peaceful days, Shah Rukh set his focus on developing peaceful relations across Eurasia. The most notorious of these embassies left Samarkand in 1419, on its way to Beijing. Again, in contrast to Timur, Shah Rukh would see the Ming dynasty of China as an ally and valuable trading partner. After all, it was where the Silk Road started, a trade route that passed straight through Timurid lands. Shah Rukh entrusted his diplomat, Ghayath al-Din, with leading the envoy to China. Ghayath kept a road diary which survives today as a Marco Polo-like story. The caravan took the northern route along the Silk Road, passing through the homeland of their Turkic ancestors, picking up many merchants as they went. At the envoy's maximum, it reached 500 men. Once arriving in China, Ghayath mentions the Chinese Christians. He revels on this, knowing that the Christian domains lay far to the west. In 1420, the Timurid diplomat arrived in the brand new Ming capital of Beijing, home to one of the most powerful rulers of China, the Yongle Emperor. After meeting the emperor and presenting him with many gifts, Yongle decided to let the diplomat stay in his court. During this time, they were under the care of a Turkish man who held an important advisory role. His competence as a linguist was something to behold, knowing Mongolian, Turkish, Arabic, as well as multiple Chinese dialects. The highlights of Ghayath's trip to China included impressive acrobatic performances almost daily, huge amounts of food at feasts fit to feed hundreds, as well as a tour of the many gardens sprinkled throughout the forbidden city of the emperor. He also tells about China's booming economy and incredibly fast courier systems. Not only this, but he also gets a glimpse at the Yongle Emperor's darker side, watching as he committed men to a more brutal torture than Timur could ever think to commit: death by 1,000 cuts. After 5 well-spent months in Beijing, relations were finally restored, and Ghayath departed to make his long journey home. He arrived in Samarkand in 1422, after more than 3 years of travel. With relations recovered with the Ming, let's take a wider look at the geopolitical position of the restored Timurid Empire. In the east, the Delhi Sultanate had not yet recovered from Timur's brutal sacking. Shah Rukh also expanded trade relations with coastal India. To the north, the Golden Horde was no longer a vassal, but still not much of a threat. The Chagatai Khanate, who had previously attacked the Timurids, was still held in a truce since then, and despite their proximity to Samarkand, they still presented little threat to Shah Rukh. To the south, the Timurids had control of the Persian Gulf and a slice of Arabia through their vassal of Hormuz. But to the west, Kara Yusuf was still at large, and with an ally, the Mamluks of Egypt. This was the only outside threat left for Shah Rukh to subdue. After 5 years of patient peace, he decided it was due time to avenge his brother's killer. In 1420, Shah Rukh conquered a small state sandwiched in between the two Turkic superpowers. This was a preemptive move to cover his back before setting off on his defining campaign. Following this, Shah Rukh concluded a military alliance with his enemy's backyard rival, the Ak-Kanulu, or the White Sheep Turkomans. Soon after the Timurids invaded Kara-Kanulu proper, its ruler, Kara Yusuf, gathered his army to defeat the Timurids once again. He was nearing the Timurid host when he suddenly fell sick and died. One of the most anticlimactic ends to a great rivalry and a skilled general. In his place, the Kara-Kanulu would fall apart just as the Timurid Empire had after the death of its founder. 4 of Kara Yusuf's sons would claim the throne and throw the land into chaotic civil war. Now playing by Yusuf's own rules, the Kara-Kanulu were easily picked apart and mostly conquered by 1422. Having mostly subdued the Black Sheep Turkomans, Shah Rukh appointed a governor over his new Azeri and Armenian lands before returning home. Where Timur may have plundered and looted his way to a surefire victory, Shah Rukh spared civilians and stationed garrisons to protect his gains. There is only 2 ways people will let you rule over them, and that is if they fear you or they love you. The brothers, still fighting one another over scraps, made time to focus on their withdrawn enemy. The eldest of the four sons, Ispend, reclaimed the interior portion of the Kara Knulu, but he didn't have time to conquer Azerbaijan before the third, oldest brother appeared on his doorstep. Kara Iskander had already proclaimed himself Sultan. Now he was here to reassert his jurisdiction over the land his brother had just conquered in Iraq. After a battle, Kara Iskander prevailed, but showed mercy on the man who had the best claim to their ancestral seat of power. With this, the Kara Empire was nearly restored, with the big exception of Azerbaijan, which was one of their strongholds. Kara Iskander even managed to defeat the coalition as a whole, driving the white sheep away from the land both grazed on. Despite having his army and several other Timurid hosts intact, Shah Rukh did not relaunch his invasion of the west, intent on holding Azerbaijan tightly. However, to the north, the disunited Golden Horde had unified under Batak Khan. Shah Rukh's son Ulugh Beg was offering support to Batak Khan, hoping the north would be secured by a powerful ally yet again. But just as Toktamish had, Batak Khan started reconquering Timurid lands, and even defeated Ulugh Beg in battle. And just like him, Batak was overthrown by a civil war within years. For now, the northern border was safe, made dangerous it appears by the dabbling of Ulugh Beg. In 1424, Rustam, Timur's loyal nephew, died. And just when they needed him, yet again a threat emerged from the Chagatai. Ulugh Beg himself defeated the opposing Khan. With that, he finally achieved the goal of protecting the shortest route to Samarkand. A religious movement started to overtake the empire. In order of Sufi Islam, Harufism was threatening to destroy the Timurid Empire from within. In a story not so dissimilar from Jesus and the Roman Empire, Timur killed the founder of Harufism, a theological scholar named Asturbadi, leaving the Harufis as an anti-state religion. Timur was so bloodthirsty, a whole Sufi sect became popular because of it. Shah Rukh, in what is becoming a theme, did nothing about it. Harufism only grew further, and was even practiced by some of the many assorted scholars of Samarkand, many of which were only there because Timur had burned their city to the ground. This wasn't a problem for Shah Rukh, until it very suddenly became one. A man disguised in a shepherd's fur coat catches his first glimpse of Shah Rukh as he exits the mosque. He approaches him slowly, as if he was only passing by. Suddenly he grabbed for his knife and lunged at Shah Rukh. This man's name was Ahmed Lur, a previous commander under the notorious Ahmad Jaliyir. Even from the grave, the Jaliyirid was attacking the Timurids. Shah Rukh attempted to defend himself, but was stabbed 2 times before the royal guard could seize him. Shah Rukh recovered from his wounds in due time, but the attack had finally made the complacent Sultan act. After connecting Ahmed Lur to the Harufis and the Jaliyirids, it soon became clear that the Timurid enemies could use this religion as a unifying force. If it was Timur they were mad at, then Shah Rukh was gonna remind them what his half of the Prince of Destruction looked like. Shah Rukh began a purging of the Harufis. Knowing it had become commonplace among his scholars, he ordered interrogations and exiled many of Islam's brightest minds. He even went as far as interrogating his artistically minded son. No, not Ulugh Beg, but the third-born, Baisungar, who was just as capable an artist as his elder brother was a scientist. He was arrested and found not to have any involvement in Harufism. After this, most Harufis were forced to leave the empire. The Sufi order died out soon after, in the 15th century. Having purged his intellectuals, Shah Rukh ceased pressing the issue much farther. This was likely the cruelest thing Shah Rukh did during his reign, which is something to say considering his ancestry. 3 years later, in 1429, Kara Iskander was becoming increasingly confident and began attacking the Timurids outright yet again. Shah Rukh gathered an army of over 100,000 men and sent it to deal with the Black Sheep. When the two armies clashed, it appeared that a long day of fighting was ahead of the survivors. And then, Iskander's youngest brother, Abu Sa'id, defected to the Timurid army mid-battle, causing Iskander to quickly retreat all the way to the far west of his realm. His plans falling into place, Shah Rukh consolidated his role over much of Karakanulu, then handed it directly to Abu Sa'id, who would become his new pawn. And then Shah Rukh made the same mistake twice, and concluded the campaign before capturing Sultan Iskander. Not even a year following this grand campaign, Kara Iskander's ally, the Mamluks, finally came out of hiding, taking away Shah Rukh's probe in the area. As before, Iskander defeated his brother. However, this time he executed Abu Sa'id before retaking the rest of his sultanate. The western border for over 20 years has still not been tamed, and presented a looming disaster. Unlike before, Kara Iskander began to pick on the Timurid ruler of Azerbaijan, the Shirvan Shah. The Black Sheep invaded and raided, but could not take the mountain strongholds. Shah Rukh again did nothing. He waited for some reason. Perhaps he was about to restart his campaign, and that's when his son, Baisungur, fell ill. He would die young in 1433. In the following year, Shah Rukh would invade the Karakanulu for the third time in his reign. The same course of actions would follow. Iskander retreated, Shah Rukh conquered most of the land, and then gave it to Iskander's brother. This time it was Jahan Shah's turn. As was at the beginning of the war, another son of Shah Rukh died unexpectedly, but thankfully not the Ulugh Beg. As expected, Kara Iskander returned, but this time he was repulsed and retreated. That's when an old enemy reared its head toward them, the Ak-Kanulu. In exchange for helping the Timurids, the Ak-Kanulu were promised protection from their Mamluk subjugators, as well as from their Black Sheep counterparts. An army led by one of Shah Rukh's sons and Ak-Kanulu ruler, Kara Ulugh, ambushed Kara Iskander and his dwindling number of followers. The long-term and 79-year-old Timurid ally was finally planning a lasting revenge on the Black Sheep Turkomans. However, his plans would be dashed as the surprised and outnumbered Kara Iskander managed to push the coalition army away. Denying his own safety, Kara Ulugh charged himself and his bodyguard into the fray of the battle. He was after one thing, the head of his rival. Unfortunately, he didn't get time before he himself was cut down. Kara Ulugh can be considered the founder of the Ak-Kanulu state. His 57-year reign ensured the smooth transition from steppe tribe to a settled and well-established society. The Ak-Kanulu had only just begun. While Kara Ulugh was in his heroic last stand, Shah Rukh's son made a run for it and safely made it back. At least 3 sons hadn't died after or before a battle with Kara Iskander. With nowhere left to fight, Iskander left his lands and made way to the Ottoman Empire, which had somehow managed to recover from the devastation and civil war left over from Timur's conquest. Sultan Murad II declined any invitation to support Kara Iskander, knowing better than to help a Timurid enemy after Ankara. He even denied him entrance into his empire, After a few days' rest, Iskander was on the road, a sultan without a sultanate. With what remained of his army, he returned to the Kara Kanulu, en route to slay another Timurid-aligned brother. Outnumbered, he was defeated by his older brother, Jahan Shah. With nowhere left to go and a handful of loyal men behind him, Kara Iskander attempted to flee to Egypt, home to a once powerful empire. One night, seeing the delusional father become the Imaj Aliyar of his day, Iskander's own son murdered him. After 4 campaigns, Shah Rukh's armies had finally defeated their most dangerous neighbor, and in the process gained a bulwark of an alliance. During the long reign of Jahan Shah, the last of Kara Yusuf's children to hold power, he would expand the Kara Kanulu to its largest extent and enjoy a flicker of a golden age. In the life of Shah Rukh, however, this would never be an issue. With no one left to defeat, Shah Rukh did what he did best. Absolutely nothing. The Timurid Empire entered a golden age of peace. For 10 whole years, Shah Rukh would be the just ruler of a realm which never knew peace. Sure, the occasional rebellion popped up here and there, but this would be the safest the Timurid Empire would ever be. While Shah Rukh wasn't the most militarily minded ruler, his strength was drawn from his lack of enemies. He never really suddenly attacked a nation unless he had to. Where Shah Rukh excelled was in development, diplomacy, and delegation of power. Shah Rukh can be considered the second founder of the Timurid state. He truly settled the nomadic empire that he had inherited. He adopted Persian customs along with his subjects, and when he wasn't persecuting Harufism, scholars continued to visit Samarkand as a hub of learning, led by his astronomy master's son, Ulugh Beg. His mostly passive manner ensured that the might makes right of the steppe would not apply in his empire. He even went as far as abandoning the Yargu court, a traditional Turkish assembly that would investigate all sort of matters such as treason. Shah Rukh calls this agency tyrannical and corrupted before dissolving it. In place of steppe tradition, Shah Rukh, who was said to be a devout Muslim, adopted more Sharia law, thereby matching the religion of the majority of his subjects. Shah Rukh was not so much a direct ruler, as he was a great appointer of competent people at the core of his empire. His sons were well learned and some of them experienced generals. His wife took secular and humanitarian matters into her hands. Her mosque alone stands as a great achievement, along with being a true friend of Shah Rukh. First was Ghiyath al-Din, who served as Shah Rukh's vizier for 30 years and after that became an advisor to a few of Shah Rukh's grandsons. As the head of the military after Rostam, a man named Jalal-ud-Din was a useful warrior for over 35 years, becoming close to Shah Rukh's militaristically minded sons as their mentor. Most importantly, for 43 years, the entirety of Shah Rukh's reign, there was Amir Alika, the head of tax and the treasury. Perhaps Shah Rukh's closest confidant in the most important matter of statehood. Through these 3 men, Shah Rukh had his trifecta of skilled and loyal followers, advising him on every move. As the peaceful days continued, Shah Rukh became increasingly and noticeably ill in 1444. Despite this, the good days remained. 2 years later, the now exhausted and gravely sick Shah Rukh learned about a rebellion in Esfahan. The leader was one of his own grandsons, a son of Baisangar. And just when he thought these days were over, one of his direct descendants made a bid for the throne. Although he was in a dreadful state, Shah Rukh had enough strength to go on campaign and re-establish the unity of his empire for Ulugh Beg. He retook Esfahan with relative ease, and in a manner more like Timur, Shah Rukh executed many nobles of the city. This out-of-character action can be explained by what happened shortly after. Just like Timur, Shah Rukh died a few months shy of his 70th birthday. Shah Rukh sometimes receives a reputation as being a weak ruler, but I'd say he was just extremely calculating with every move he made on the board. He's one of those rulers who actually seems to be a mostly good guy, which is very rare in this time and place. Over the course of his 42-year reign, Shah Rukh nearly did nothing, but when he did take initiative, he rarely made a mistake. Besides campaigning against Kara Iskander 4 times. Where Timur was a conqueror, Shah Rukh, as his name suggests, was a true ruler and state builder. He would be succeeded by his son, whose many scientific achievements we will discuss very soon. In the night sky, there lies another world. Enjoying a stargaze is one thing, but to study the bright pinpoint fractals is not only a science, but a canvas that cannot even be completed in a lifetime of far-reaching exploration. Only a handful of people throughout history can claim to be a master of astrology, and only one of them was an emperor. He is a man most commonly referred to as Ulugh Beg, translated most closely as Great Ruler. Far from the Eurasian steppe of his ancestors, Ulugh Beg was born Mirza Muhammad Taragai on March 22nd of 1394, the son of Shah Rukh and grandson of Timur the Lame. Inheriting from both of them a curious nature and a high ceiling for intelligence to prosper. Away from the bow that Timur was using to carve out an empire, Ulugh Beg was shown the finer things in life by his father Shah Rukh. While he would still learn how to ride a horse and be taught military strategy at a young age, most of the boy's time would be spent alongside a retinue of Islam's brightest tutors and scholars, and he wouldn't want it any other way. By the time Ulugh was 10, his grandfather had completed his destructive path across the Middle East and carved out a mighty empire. But when Tamerlane died in 1405, every single member of the Timurid dynasty was at stake to lose it all, or become the Timur of their time. As the empire was thrown into separation and civil war, Ulugh Beg's father, Shah Rukh, emerged as one of the leading claimants. Ulugh Beg would spend his early teenage years nervously behind the patient and stone-faced Shah Rukh. Eventually, in 1409, after 4 years of civil war, Shah Rukh marched his army onto the Timurid capital of Samarkand, unopposed, with Ulugh Beg beside him. With the gem of Central Asia brought into the fold, Shah Rukh was to be the sole successor of Tamerlane, and Ulugh Beg was to be the intellectual future of the Middle East. With Shah Rukh's stronghold being located in the city of Herat to the south, the city of Samarkand would take on a new role in this reformed Timurid Empire. While Herat became the capital of Shah Rukh, Samarkand became the capital of Ulugh Beg, who became the governor of the city upon its capture. Without hesitation, the enthusiastic 16-year-old prince started his plans to turn Samarkand into a city of science incarnate. Thus began the golden age of the Timurid Renaissance. While Timur had forced all the scholars into Samarkand, it would be his grandson that would make it a metropolis of higher learning. Governor Ulugh Beg would be forced from his studies early on in his new position. An old threat reappeared in the form of Mogolistan, Its position so close to Samarkand would threaten the Timurid heartland. If Ulugh Beg did not act, then no one would. Along with the Timurid host, Ulugh defeated the army of the outnumbered Khanate and submitted them to a peace treaty with relative ease. Although most of his time was dedicated to the stars, Ulugh appeared efficient on the battlefield, taking his first victory and returning to Samarkand in earnest. Although the northern flank of the empire was secured, Ulugh Beg still did not have the proper funds to turn Samarkand into a beacon of education. This was due to the position of the empire as a whole, Shah Rukh having to pour funds into the military and other more neglected parts of the empire. In 1417, Ulugh finally acquired the money to construct a massive school, or madrasa. The building still stands to this day and would play host to some of Islam's most learned astrologers and mathematicians. The school employed masters of astronomy such as Qadi al-Rumi and al-Kashi, who were both extremely respected in their own right. The brightest pupil at this university, perhaps even more so than Ulugh Beg, was Ali Kushji, a student of weather, astronomy, math, as well as other natural sciences. Younger than even Ulugh Beg, Ali was the son of Ulugh's personal royal falconer, lending him a close connection with the governor of Samarkand. Together, they represented a fresh young face to the stars above, something that was in dire need of re-examining. In 1419, in a separate caravan from Shah Rukh's, Ulugh Beg would personally travel all the way to Ming China. Here he would meet with the Yongle Emperor at the imperial city of Beijing. He presented him with gifts, including a jet black stallion and horseshoes made by Samarkand's finest blacksmith. 20 years later, Yongli's successor would repay this gift by sending a portrait of that same horse to Ulugh Beg, among other, more expensive treasures. Ulugh Beg no doubt spent time among the scientists and scholars of the Ming Empire, sharing discoveries, if only the Yongle Emperor was ready to spill the precious and sometimes advanced knowledge of the Ming. After being absent for 2 years, Ulugh returned to Samarkand, and just in time to see the completion of his madrasa. It is preserved as a UNESCO heritage site to this day. Not only did the madrasa play host to an ensemble of Islam's best minds, but it was also heavily diverse. Due to Timur's habit of sparing scholars during his many campaigns, Turkish astronomers mingled with Arabian mathematicians and Persian spoke philosophy with Brahmins from India. With his educational foundation set, let's take a look at Ulugh Beg's personal life. Apart from studying, Ulugh could be found hosting lavish banquets. When he wasn't observing the stars at night, he was either sleeping during the day, training militarily, although sparsely, or spending time in his harem along with his 13 wives. Only 2 years after his return from the east, Ulugh Beg would face a number of threats from the north. First, and perhaps more dangerously, the Golden Horde had unified yet again under the thumb of Batak Khan, a man that Ulugh Beg had helped to secure this position. Pacifying the north through alliance was a good idea, if Batak Khan did not turn on Ulugh as soon as he secured his power base. Having mistaken foe for friend, Ulugh Beg assembled his army to defeat the invading Golden Horde. Here he was embarrassingly defeated outright on the battlefield. The grandson of Timur was not raised on the bow like his predecessors, and it was starting to show. He returned to Samarkand to lick his wounds. Batak Khan would eventually be defeated by a civil war, and his successor would have a much friendlier and less traitorous relations with the Timurid Empire. Only a year after his first defeat, Mogulistan saw weakness and attempted to invade. Some miles outside of Samarkand, Ulugh defeated the Chagatai, reversing his fortunes and securing the north yet again. The governor of Samarkand, although with a setback, was still keeping the steppe checked. With the gold paid from the ensuing peace treaty, Ulugh Beg celebrated by christening the start of his crowning achievement, the Grand Observatory of Samarkand. At a very young age, Ulugh Beg, while accompanying Timur's army across Persia, came to see one of the greatest observatories of his day. Located in Maraghi, this building would serve as inspiration for many of the Islamic world's observatories, including Ulugh Beg's. A skilled architect named Kashani would be the one to invent this one-of-a-kind structure. The foundation of Samarkand's observatory took 2 years alone to dig out and lay. Decorated with marble on the inside, most of the structure actually laid under the ground, on top of a hill to offer more versatility and space for astronomical tools. After completing the base, the observatory stood 33 meters high, ordained with brick in the typical Turco-Persian patterns. After 4 years of construction, one of the most creative observatories in history was complete. Now, the skilled scholars of Samarkand finally had an instrument to keep up with their intellectual prowess. In a time before telescopes, the architect Kashani commissioned for a massive sextant to be built instead. At the time of its completion, it was the largest of its kind in the world, and could measure the stars on the same level as a high-powered telescope, when used in the right hands. Having picked 60 of his best astronomers and mathematicians, Ulugh Beg set off on a path of discovery and correction. The greatest astrologer in antiquity was none other than Ptolemy, a man who discovered many things about the stars and in more creative ways than Ulugh Beg. His works, although advanced for the time, were about 1,600 years outdated. One of Ulugh's first missions was to correct the otherwise unproven, perfect works of Ptolemy. He made new star charts, observing 11 less stars than Ptolemy, as well as correcting their positions in space. By the time Ulugh was done, he had built heavily upon his work, and had finished the preliminary portion of his exploration into the night sky. After 10 years of dedicated research, the scholars of Samarkand published the Zigi Saltini, a star chart whose accuracy would not be matched for over 200 years. The next few years would see a flurry of discoveries, including the near-accurate time of the sidereal year. In more simpler terms, the amount of time it takes the Earth to complete its rotation around the Sun. The calculation only added another 58 seconds to the year, making it the closest estimate until the works of Copernicus. A year later, Ulugh's team discovered a more accurate time for the year. They used an opposite strategy, observing how long it took for the sun to return to its original position in the sky. This only had the minute difference of an added 25 seconds, making it more accurate than Copernicus some 100 years later. The accuracy of this measurement would not be matched until Tycho Brahe, a few decades after the death of Copernicus. Even still, sometime after this, Ulugh Beg managed to create a near-accurate tilt of the Earth, observing a certain number of stars in accordance with Earth's seasonal rotations. But to be a master astronomer, you have to be an even better mathematical prodigy. Ulug completed the trigonomic function of sine and tangent to the 8th decimal, the most accurate for this place in the world at this time. These are just some of the most important discoveries made by Ulug Beg and his reputed team. Overall, these men would produce hundreds of scientific works in their time and contribute to the sciences in a way that not many could match in a pre-modern world. While Ulug was stuck to the stars, his father was presiding over a peaceful golden age of the Timurid Empire. In 1447, this would all change. A rebellion of one of Shah Rukh's grandsons and nephew to Ulug Beg broke out in Iran. An aged and sickly Shah Rukh crushed his opponent before dropping dead himself, leaving Ulug Beg as the new Timurid emperor, the most educated individual to hold this position. While Ulug Beg, as his name suggests, was a great ruler as a governor of Samarkand, the same would not prove true when he became emperor. Governing a city effectively was one thing, but the whole empire was a different challenge, perhaps harder to navigate than even the stars. During Shah Rukh's early reign, he only kept the empire together by the skin of his teeth. Ulug would meet many of these same challenges as his nephew, Ala al-Dawla, claimed the throne and positioned himself around Herat in defiance. Ulug marched and managed to defeat the rebel, who fled in retreat. After this, the newly crowned emperor turned on the city of Herat, the capital of his father. In his eyes, the Timurid Empire had but one shining city as its capital, and that was Samarkand. Ulug proceeded as his grandfather might and sacked the city, massacring its population. This action was supposed to quell the internal squabbling, but it only served to strengthen the cause of the rebels, who no longer feared or respected their emperor. With help from his brother, Ala al-Dawla returned to face Ulug Beg again. Together they defeated the Timurid emperor and handed Ulug Beg his second and final defeat on the battlefield. The downtrodden Ulug retreated to the city of Balkh, which was governed by his son, Abd al-Latif. Upon arriving, the empire unraveled further, when it soon became apparent that his own son had revolted against him. With his army in tatters, Ulug had only to return to Samarkand. More trouble appeared as the city devolved into mass rioting. Ulug dispersed these mobs, but by the time order had been restored, Abd al-Latif had marched on Samarkand. In 1449, he threatened to put the city to siege, sparing his city and its many Ulug-sponsored buildings. The emperor of under 2 years abdicated his throne and became a prisoner of his son. Later in that year, Ulug petitioned to make Hajj to Mecca. This was accepted and Ulug started his way towards the Kaaba. He wouldn't leave Timurid lands before he was assassinated by men loyal to Abd al-Latif. What followed the death of Ulug Beg would see the Timurids fall into near unending civil wars that would eventually cause the decline of the empire. Excluding the Mughals of India, the Timurids and Central Asia for that matter would never see a golden age and renaissance on this level ever again. Without its leader and emperor, the Observatory of Samarkand became a place for astrologists to argue rather than research. Eventually, the building fell into disrepair and collapsed onto itself. The underground section, along with the massive sextant, still remains, as well as the many discoveries made due to this hilltop trench. Only a year later, Ulugh Beg's body would be laid to rest alongside his father and grandfather in the Guri Amir Mausoleum by his nephew, Abdallah Mirza. If we compare the portraits of Abdallah to Ulugh Beg, we can see the absence of one thing: the stars. Almost as if they had left with the death of the great ruler. Ulugh Beg was many things. He probably could have been a great ruler, but was never really given the chance to do so. Instead, he created something more lasting that would transcend his own life and every astronomer in Samarkand. While we're nearing the end, let's take a look at some of the things named after Ulugh Beg. First, and unsurprisingly, a moon crater is named after him, as well as an asteroid belt. Thirdly, and rather strangely, there is a dinosaur called the Ulugh Begsaurus, which was named as such in 2021. The three great rulers of the Timurid Empire are perhaps the greatest example of the nomadic cycle. Timur was the conqueror, Shahrukh was the consolidator, and Ulugh Beg was no longer a nomad, but more like the people Timur had conquered. Together, their collective achievements, although drastically different from each other, would never be forgotten. And that is the golden age of the Timurid Empire. If you'd like to support this Stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Voician, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, and Dalinar. Or become a YouTube channel member, like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, What? Why? And Nickmate Voician again. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.